yeah, I'm a member of many groups of fans of particular artists, Bruce obviously being one. And it's lovely when I find podcasts like the podcast that you broadcast, because it's just like hanging out with a couple of good mates and eavesdropping on a conversation about someone you love, something you love, and you're leaning into the conversation, and then all of a sudden, I can be listening to you, and I almost like I'm interrupting you. I'm saying, no, hang on a minute. What about you're not considering that album?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Set Listing Bruce, your podcast all about Bruce Springsteen, his music, and mostly his fans. I am your host, Jesse Jackson. Joining me today is my new friend, Sean Rowley. We've already been talking. Guys, this may go long because we are having a fun. Welcome to the podcast, Sean. How are you doing?
Jesse, thank you. I'm doing really, really well. I'm located over here speaking to you live and direct from the UK. It's a lovely spring day as I look out across the garden.
That is great. Yeah, this is a timey-wimey episode. My morning, your afternoon. It's always fun. So we have a lot to talk about. So let's get right to the beginning. Tell us a little about yourself.
Okay. So I'll give you a very brief potted history of who I am, minus the Bruce detail, because I think I've got a feeling, knowing how you run your podcast, we'll get stuck into the Bruce stuff. That's right. The main course. Here very we go nice. With the moosh boosh.
I love
it. I was born in 1961. I was brought up in a suburb of London, just outside of London. I like to, in a romantic sort of way, and connecting me to Bruce, like to think of it as my version of New Jersey, but I don't know about that. But I was brought up in that area. I remember sort of just being a huge fan of music from a kid. The radio was constantly on. Music wasn't really in the house through my mum and dad until the early 70s, when my dad had a little bit of cash and he went out and he bought a music system. And I'm sure that there are listeners to your podcast of a certain age who will know exactly, who can picture it straight away. It's like a sort of smoked glass top with a record player, a cassette player, and a radio tuner. That is combined. It was the height of technology, and my dad bought this. It was like the pride of the house, but we actually didn't have any records to play on it. So I remember I was with him one Saturday afternoon when we went into the local town, and there was a record shop, and I walked into the record shop and it was, wow, there's lots of records here. And my dad walked up to the counter and he said, I've just bought a music system, and he said, I want you to recommend 3 records that I can take away with me. And that day he bought the Beatles' Abbey Road, Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water, and James Taylor, Sweet Baby James. And we took those records home, and I never stopped playing those records. Those records I knew every groove, every bump, every crack, every popple of those records. It was just totally ingrained in me, and I fell in love with music in that moment. And then, as a kid growing up, well, the thing was that I didn't really embrace the music of the time. So if the early and mid 70s was dominated in the rock world by sort of what we tend to call over here in the UK prog rock, I don't know, like bands like Pink Floyd, Genesis, Yes. If they were the order of the day, that wasn't floating my boat. So as as someone who needed to hear music and wanted to be inspired by music, I found myself drifting back to the music of the 60s and then even further back into the music of the 50s. And again, another sort of cultural phenomena that was occurring in the UK was like a nostalgic trip back to the 50s. So in the mid 70s, the mid 50s was the coolest place to be, and there was imported TV shows. The likes of Happy Days was like a big show in the UK, and I was really drawn into this. This was big, and then I went to see American Graffiti, the movie, at my local cinema, and it just blew my head, and I was just engrossed in this music of another period. I didn't want to know about music of I'd go into school and people would be talking about Led Zeppelin, and I sort of wouldn't even know who they were. I wanted to talk about Elvis and Gene Vincent, Little Richard and Eddie Cochran and other such of that ilk. And pretty soon I sort of got on board with contemporary music as not so much punk, but new wave kicked in, and it felt like it was a little bit more lively. And then, and I'm just going to give reference to this and we'll come back to it, then I had my connection with Bruce, and it was via a TV interview that happened that was aired in the UK in 1978. And I was totally on board with Bruce. But on my personal side of my life was that by this point, I was leaving school. And the other thing that was hand in hand with my music obsession was I was really into sport, and was very big in like competing. I was a member of my local swimming club and athletics club, and I was running marathons and really getting into sport. So there was a connection that I had whereby that took me off to become a physical training instructor in the police force, believe it or not, for a number of years. And then that sort of came to an end because of injury, actually, and that sort of put pay to my my athletics career. And so I sort of started to think about, well, how can I take my obsession with music and try and turn it into something that I could make a living out of? And I wormed my way into starting to work for a record company, and I became a plugger. In the mid 80s, this was a job that was basically my task to get bands, new bands, and their new releases on either the radio or the TV, and I was, pretty good at that. And then I sort of started to run out of steam and lost enthusiasm for that, and found myself almost like a sort of secondhand car dealer, just trying to push bands on radio, and it was just. I felt like it was draining my love of music. So I did a quick switch and went over onto the other side whereby I became a music booker on a TV show. We've had a late night talk show presenter by the name of Jonathan Ross, who was like our equivalent of someone like Letterman was in the USA. And I became the guy who booked the bands that appeared on the Jonathan Ross show.
That is amazing. I know Jonathan Ross because of Fool Us. He hosted 2 seasons of Fool Us. Absolutely great guy. That would be someone fun to visit with. I want to go back just for a moment.
Please do.
The person working at the record store picked 3 pretty damn good albums, didn't they?
He did, didn't he? He did. And they were, I mean, if you would have pushed me into a corner, I'd probably come and say, what are your top 10 favorite albums of all time? Yeah. Probably all 3 of those would figure in there. I still adore all of those records.
Yeah, I just think, as you were telling that, I was like, wow, a pretty good albums of the era, but also good albums that have stood the test of time.
They have.
Amazing.
They have. And do you know what else about them, to get a little bit sort of train spottery about them?
Yeah.
All 3 of them are absolutely stunning sonic records. They are the quality of the recording. And I think that's probably what the guy who was working in the record shop, because my dad was slightly boasting about this music system. And it's like, give me 3 really great records that will sound absolutely amazing on this sound system. And that's sort of why we ended up with those.
Yeah, I think that was it. The other, I remember seeing American Graffiti and the same thing, Blown Away. And I also know, you think about it, that you could make the argument that changed the music business because it was the first soundtrack, as in, hey, let's not a orchestra Henry Mancini doing music, but let's take pop hits and put them on and then sell them as a collection. I remember loving that movie. And then also just the soundtrack, because I was born in 59, so you and I are almost the same age, right? And that I grew up on top 40 radio. I was missing Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd and all that because I had an AM radio that I lived off of, so all the ELO and Elton John and Barry Manilow and Foreigner and all these, top 40 hits. So yeah, I love that American Graffiti did that for you.
Oh man, I remember. Do you know what, Jesse? Even now I can picture myself. I went to a double. It was like a double screening of. It wasn't at the time of release. I think the release is about 72, 73. I probably saw it 74, 75 as a double bill with Car Wash.
Okay.
And American Graffiti was on before Car Wash.
Right.
And American Graffiti. And I was up for Car Wash. I'm a huge fan of 70s disco as well. So yeah. I went along to the cinema. I'm pretty sure I went by myself. I remember sitting there and my legs were up and it wasn't very busy. It was an afternoon show. And as that film unfolded, I think my mouth must have dropped lower and lower as I marveled at what it was saying to me. And I think what I got from it was this just ultimate sense of freedom. And it was almost like I was looking at those characters on the screen and projecting obviously myself into there, but not as well. And it was like this fantasy land. That's what I think Coppola was really produced brilliantly well with it. It was like 20, as anyone who's not seen, it's 24 hours in the life of a bunch of kids in a small, sleepy Californian town, and it's graduation, and they're not too sure what they're doing with their life. And I think it might have connected for me at that brilliant moment of adolescence in one's life where you're going, I don't really know what's going on here. But you're not, if someone's trying to map out a path for you, you don't particularly want to take that path. You're going to find another route out of it. But the music, what you said about the music, that was it. That was it. And Wolfman Jack, man, it was like that character, that the late night DJ, which of course is then, as my story progressed, I became a DJ. In my dreams, I became Wolfman Jack.
What, so it sounds like you went through, many of us, like many of us do, you go through different jobs and going through, I talk to me little bit about working with Jonathan Ross. I'm sure you maybe didn't work with him directly as much, but what were some of your successes in booking people? Because I mean, this would be like Late Night with David Letterman or The Tonight Show or Live with Jimmy Kimmel. I mean, it's that type of show, right?
Yeah, but to tell you the truth, Jesse, what this show was, the show that I worked on with Jonathan, we did 2 seasons of.
Okay.
It wasn't ridiculously successful,
okay.
But you will grasp exactly what the format of the show. It was basically the British version of Saturday Night Live.
Oh, okay, very nice.
And it was called Saturday Zoo.
Okay.
And it was live. It was a live broadcast.
Oh, exciting!
And it was comedy, and it was stand up, and there would always be a band. There was a band that was featured every week, and that was my task, was to locate the band. I mean, there's a whole load of sort of UK centric bands that took to the stage, but I'm just trying to rack my brains of American flavor. We had Lenny Kravitz on. We had the
nice.
on. It was, Jonathan was actively involved. Jonathan would always sort of, you had to get the thumbs up from Jonathan in order to say that's the band. And he's a top music man. He loves his music and always has done. In fact, his career started as a music researcher on the UK equivalent of Soul Train. He used to
Oh,
go out
really?
and
I
find
did not know
acts.
that.
Yeah. That was so he started behind the scenes working on that. So yeah, and it was really good fun. It was a good. It was. I mean, again, it's drawing a parallel with something like Saturday Night Live, which is obviously a huge American institute. But it was our little attempt at that.
Yeah. Did you talk to me about how you ended up? Because obviously you've spent a lot of time behind the mic being a DJ. So how did you tell me a little about your journey to become a Wolfman Jack in your mind?
In my dreams.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So it was the next step from music researcher on the Jonathan Ross Saturday Zoo show was to then go off and work a number of jobs behind the scenes in music production. So I ended up doing a little stint at MTV Europe. I ended up working on a sort of late night, how could I describe, anarchic TV show that was called The Word, that went out in the UK. And again, it was the format that was sort of comedy, music, live. It was pretty thrilling stuff, and I was enjoying it all. Then I had a little bit of a moment whereby I went slightly in a diversion of wanting to do something for myself, wanting to sort of come up with something creative for myself, and it led me down a path that ended up with me getting my radio show commissioned on BBC Radio 1. Now, I'm sure a lot of your listeners will know that the BBC is pretty much the main national broadcaster in the whole of the UK. So it's one station, one network, and a number of stations that transmit all across the UK, not just regional, but it bangs it out. So it's a big deal. Radio 1 is a big deal. Okay. And how I got that was a long-winded tale that I will condense down to the fact that I was a bit of a chap around the club scene in London in the mid-90s, and I was enjoying going out, and I was, I would get the opportunity to DJ out in clubs because I was a guy who had a good record collection, so people would ask me to go out and play records. And so that connection led to, so should we say, an interaction with the showbiz elite. So is not a term that I'm just clutching at straws, trying to come up with a better one. But anyhow, long-winded story short is that some of the biggest bands in the UK at the time were bands like Oasis, the solo performer Paul Weller, and I got this golden opportunity to go out as a tour DJ and play records before the bands would go on stage. This led me into thinking, and we were hanging out together, and this led me into thinking that, well, sometimes I was having these experiences where you'd go back to people's houses and you'd sort of be rifling through their record collections and you'd be playing music, and I thought there's something in this. There's almost like because what I've always loved about my obsession with music is, just to touch on Bruce slightly at this stage, is one of the big things about Bruce was the connection that he gave me back to music that he was doing cover versions of and going off and finding like the original versions. And so I'm always been up for, you might like one artist, but that artist will then lead you down a path and you will start opening up doors to a whole world of music that you'd never heard before. So there's a connection between, sort of rock stars and pop stars that are into music, that like to talk about music. So I put this down as a format and pitched it to Radio 1. And the format was, why don't we go around these famous people's houses and rifle through their record collections and get them to choose the records that they like to listen to when they're relaxing at home. And the show was called All Back to Mine, as in, why don't you all come back to mine? And the Radio 1 went, yeah, we like it. And it just so happened that one of the guys who had agreed to do this was Noel Gallagher from the band Oasis, who were pretty much one of the biggest phenomenons in sort of the mid-90s in the UK. I know they sort of came over to the US and sort of registered slightly over there, but this was big news. So the first show that I put together under the banner of All Back to Mine was broadcast in 1997, Christmas Day. It went out on Radio 1. So that was my first radio show, was on Christmas Day on the national radio station. And I was like, and that was it. I was off and running, and it was, we developed it as an idea. It then knocked on to becoming a TV show. From that, I was then up and running and working as a radio presenter, presenting shows on stations such as BBC Radio London. And that's the moment where I really was Wolfman Jack, because I was, my first show that I hosted, literally as a DJ, as a presenter, on BBC Radio London, was the late night show. I was broadcasting between the hours of 1 o'clock at night and 6 o'clock in the morning on Saturday nights. And I couldn't believe it. I was pinching myself, and I had a free reign. That was it. I could play anything I wanted to play for 5 hours. Man alive, was that a thrill?
Oh, and, I bet.
Yeah, and that was me. That was me arriving at my Wolfman Jack moment.
I love the premise. People have asked me, and I've told this story multiple times. There is a local sports station that talks, all the different Dallas and other sports stories. And one of the guys is in his 70s. His name is Norm Hitzges. And, he's been in this business forever. And he tells the story that if you talk to Nolan Ryan, who is a famous baseball pitcher, about he's had more strikeouts than anyone else, and he's pitched more no-hitters than anyone else. And so if you try to talk to Nolan about his no-hitters, you get a very polite kind of routine answer. But if you ask him about the home runs he's hit, which is only like 2 or 3, his face lights up and he talks. And I always think that if I had a chance to talk to a member of the E Street Band or someone of quote unquote celebrity, I would try to ask them the questions that people don't ask. And I think the idea, right, of why is this album, why do you have the soundtrack to Xanadu in your album collection? Oh, I love Xanadu. I went to that, right? You could hear that story. Like if I had gone through your record company and I go, oh, you have the soundtrack to American Graffiti. Oh, Jesse, let me tell you, right? So I love that concept. I bet that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was, again, it's a succession of like pinching myself moments of thinking, hey, this is my job. I'm getting paid to do this. I'm getting paid to spread the word about this thing that I truly, truly love. But what's really interesting, Jesse, the way that you just brought in there a reference to something like is the Xanadu soundtrack, because that was where things started to tip into something else, because there was always this thing that I had with music, which was, it was almost like if your mates came round your house and you'd been down the pub or a bar and you'd sort of go, yeah, come back to mine and we'll get some takeouts and we'll carry on this moment and we'll put music into the mix. And you'd be flicking through the record collection and you'd pull out and you go, I didn't know you had a thing for Barbra Streisand. It was like there was this part of I hold that everyone's got it, and it was the next thing that was the development of where things went for me next, which was to look at those records that people slightly felt, let's just say, a little bit ashamed of owning, that they might hide when they knew their mates were coming round instead of putting them to the front of the pile. And the term guilty pleasures had been knocking around a little bit, and I'd heard it as a reference to other things. And I thought, and this is what I brought into my radio show. I thought, if I can, I know, and the record, I brought in a couple of records on the radio show, and I said, look, before I play this record, I know it's a little bit naff and cheesy, but you know what? It's actually a great record. And something like, for example, Andrew Gold's Never Let Us Slip Away.
Right.
Now, I'm sorry, you're a cold-hearted man if your heart does not melt to that record. And I started to play those sort of tunes on there, prefacing it by saying, this is, I guess, what one would call a guilty pleasure. And it just snowballed. It just took off. It flew. It was like every time I played one on the show, the switchboard would light up with people ringing in. I thought at first they were ringing in to complain. It was the opposite. They were ringing in to contribute their guilty pleasures to the mix. So pretty soon I had this format that I was running with, and Sony came to me. They'd heard that it was quite a success on the show and said, do you want to put together a compilation album? So back in the early 2000s, I put together the first Guilty Pleasures compilation album. That just took off like no one's business. And pretty soon I was out DJing in clubs playing these records. And well, to tell you the truth, that was 17 years ago. And I'm still doing it. I'm still going out under the banner of Guilty Pleasure. I've got a gig. I'll be leaving here for my conversation with you and going off to do a gig in London later tonight. I've travelled. Well, I've just come back from Australia with it. We've released 5 compilations along the way. I mean, it's basically turned into my job. So that little moment, that Xanadu moment, was my moment of really a snowballing effect that just took off.
You know, Terry Smith, who's been on the podcast multiple times, does an episode called Music Talks, and it's an absolutely beautiful podcast. What he does is he asks his guests to pick an album, a song from every decade they've been alive, and then that leads to a conversation. So like, you know, your first episode, you know, you would pick a song from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, 90s, all the way up. And he talks about often he believes and he understands why people use the phrase guilty pleasure, but to him, there's just pleasure, right? If you love, like, you know, Can't Smile Without You, Barry Manilow, I you know, it makes me smile, right? You know, I remember singing, you know, trying to sing Weekend in New England when he hits that high voice on Manilow. You know, there is just so much. Music brings you joy, and there is so much in this world. Even before we got a pandemic, before we've got this rise of just unkind conservatism. I'm not saying, I don't want to get too political. Conservatism in itself is not a bad thing. The idea of less government doing things, I understand, but this mean-spirited governments that we're seeing in the US, and I can't speak to the UK, but based on things I've seen, right? We need joy in our lives, and whatever we can do to get that doesn't hurt someone else, we should go for.
Do you know what, Jesse? Tick box everything you just said there. It is about the joy, and you know, you need to take time out of it from it, and you know, out of when the shit hits the fan, excuse my language,
it's fine.
You really, one needs those moments. Music is everything. It's just that. In fact, you know what? I was hearing something the other day. I was listening to a woman talking about the. It was a professor talking about the really important aspect as far as mental health goes of movement. She was just talking about movement, and she was saying, and she was using music as an example of how one can use movement in without it being like, oh, I've got to exercise. It's like music can provide that, and she said and it was almost like she's done the science to back it up, and it was basically that when you listen to a tune, a recorded tune, and you really go with it and you're in there, it's not on in the background, you're committing to listening to it, and you can feel the music. You can literally feel the music in your body and what you're getting, and you will feel joy rise from that moment. And the reason is because you are forging a connection to what has actually been recorded. So you, in your own way, will have a connection to the musicians who have laid down the track in the studio all those years ago, because it's alive. You're listening to it, and the more we use that, the better we'll be.
Absolutely. So you've kind of alluded this, but tell me the story of how you first found Bruce and what about him spoke to you.
Okay. Wow. Right. Okay. So, yeah, as I was reflecting upon, there was this moment in the mid 70s where music, contemporary music, as in rock music, AM music was working for me big time.
Yeah.
I was loving everything that was coming out of the radio. But, as you go into that moment where you're perhaps becoming a little bit more serious about things, and your peers around you start reflecting the music that you think, oh, I should be listening to that. So whilst my mates were listening to, as I ran through the roll call before, Pink Floyd, Genesis, Yes, Led Zeppelin, it just wasn't connect. I was trying because I wanted to fit in, but it just wasn't connecting. Anyhow, again, as I've alluded to, music of yesteryear was the thing that I was being drawn to. Anyhow, there was a DJ that was on our radio stations there was a London radio station called Capital Radio. He was the drive time DJ, and his name was Roger Scott. So he would broadcast on this commercial radio station between 3 and 7 every single day. And every Friday night between 6 and 7, he had a segment of the show called Cruising. And Cruising was all about, it was like the sort of the UK version of American Graffiti, whatever that might be. And he would play music from the 50s and the 60s. And one week he went, okay, so I'm going to do a special one here. He said, you may not know this, but I'm a bit of a fan of this character called Bruce Springsteen. Now, at this point, Bruce wasn't really figuring in the UK. He was a cult figure, major cult figure. Born to Run, the single, I think it got to 96 in the chart. It wasn't, the album definitely made a few waves when it was out, but it wasn't a big seller.
Right.
So, Bruce wasn't a staple figure of daytime radio. So Roger Scott proceeded to play an hour's worth of music that Bruce Springsteen covered in his show. So he, what the roll call is. It's Mitch Ryder and the Detroit Wheels.
Sure.
It's the Dovells, You Can't Sit Down. It's Gary U.S. Bonds, 2:45. And literally, I've still got the cassettes where I used to tape these. And I just sat there and I thought, and it came to the end, and he referenced it again, and he said, the reason I've just played all of those is because these are the songs that Bruce Springsteen has cited as an influence on his music. And I just thought, I need to find out about this guy. That was my first step in. And pretty soon I was, if I bought the first album I would have bought was Born to Run.
Right.
But then something, I know I've heard other contributors on your show speak like this. I wasn't completely blown away. It wasn't like a sort of, that wasn't the moment.
Okay.
So I was sort of slightly on the edges, and then what happened was in 1978, there's a TV show that was running on the BBC, on BBC Two, called the Old Grey Whistle Test. It was presented by a UK presenter called Bob Harris, to give him his full name, Whispering Bob Harris.
Yeah.
And Bob was a massive Bruce fan, and he had managed to get a camera crew over to the Madison Square Garden where Bruce was recording the No Nukes footage. So what happened was, in the UK, The first time I had, we got to remember this is pre-internet, very obviously, but we sort of forget about that age. We forget about the moment where you don't, you can be a huge fan of someone, but you don't actually ever get to hear them talk because they're over there in America, and we've got no access to anything that's happening in America. America's like this dreamland. And so Bob Harris going over and interviewing Bruce Springsteen, he's in the backstage, it's after the gig. And he was basically saying to Bruce, he's talking about the influences, and Bruce is talking about Mitch Ryder and Gary U.S. Bonds. And I'm like, and this is it. The moment is happening. And then they play the Rosalita clip from No Nukes, which I watched it the other day again.
Right.
Man alive. If ever you want proof that rock and roll is a good thing, that's the moment. That's the moment you can turn to, because it's just got everything. And if you think about it, if I'm stating that, prog rock and its type are not connecting for me, it's because I want this primal spirit of rock and roll. I want it. That's what I want. I want, an extension of Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis and the Beatles. That's what I want in my music. And that's what I saw when I saw Rosalita performed at No Nukes. And that moment where at the end, where the girls jump up on stage and they've sort of mobbed him, and he's obviously loving it, but he's obviously getting a bit freaked out because he's being knocked to the ground and he can't actually get up. And he manages to stagger up and he stands in front of the mic and he does that almost like brilliantly, like a comedy, like double take, where he goes, hold on. And he puts his hands up and he's literally telling the audience, for God's sakes, just calm down a little bit so that I can get on with my job. And that, to me, that was a bing moment. That was it. I was in.
The road to Damascus moment.
Well, then, that was it. And then there was the first live experience. And the first live experience was in June of 1981 when I went to the River Tour. And that really was the sealing of the deal. That was everything.
So, Sean, I always like to preface this with the amount of times you've seen Bruce is not a fair barometer of how big of a fan you are. But do you count how many times you've seen him?
I just went on my fingers. 7.
Okay.
I've done seven gigs. Shall I rattle through them?
Sure, that sounds great.
Okay, so June 81. I'll set the scene for your American listeners. So we in the UK, we haven't got many stadiums. Well, certainly in the 70s and 80s, we didn't have many stadiums. We've got football stadiums, but like that sort of arena culture that you guys had,
right.
Probably. Yeah, a sprinkling of those across the UK. So there's Wembley Stadium, which is the huge football ground, which would hold probably, I think back in the day, the capacity was about 80 or 90,000. But next door to that is Wembley Arena, which holds 25,000. So the first gig, just as aforementioned, was the River, June 81, Wembley Arena. Then I was able to see the next 3 tours. So I went to Born in the USA, 4th of July, which was just mind-blowing. Came out and did Independence Day as the opening tune. Then I saw the Tunnel of Love again at the stadium, at Wembley Stadium. Then then I took a little hiatus from my gigs, and I saw the next time I was back was October 2002, back in the arena for the Rising. And then was very fortunate to see Glastonbury when Bruce headlined on the Saturday night at the Glastonbury Festival in 2009 on the Working on a Dream tour. Recently went back to the Wembley Stadium to see the River Revisited tour in 2016. But I was there at Watercur. I went to Broadway. I got a ticket, and in 2018, I flew over to New York and I saw that, which was pretty amazing.
That's amazing. Did tell me your thoughts on Broadway. What were your feelings?
It's a funny one, you know.
Yeah.
It's a real funny one. It's a funny one. I flew over with one of my best friends, and we got the tickets, and it was February, and we arrived in New York. So it was two really close friends on a weekend in New York. We're both fathers, so it was, you know, it was.
Yeah.
In fact, my mate brought his teenage son with him, which was a really lovely treat as well. But we got over there, and it snowed, and it really snowed. And on the day of the gig, it dumped it. And I was like, and we were, I just said to my friend in the morning of the gig, I said, we've got to get to that theatre. We've got to get there, and we've got to make sure that we're there in the area. Because you know, we've flown from the UK to see, we're not missing out on this because we can't get to the theatre because of snow. So we set out on our journey. It was like Scott of the Antarctic. We set out on our journey, and we got there. We got our tickets. We held our tickets in hand. We went off, and we just sort of killed a bit of time. Anyhow, gig was on. We were in the theatre. I had just phenomenal seats. I was probably about 8 rows from the front, centre. It took my breath away to the point whereby I can't remember too much. I know this sounds crazy, but to have that experience, it was almost like the shock of being in that intimate surround, and having that experience was almost too much to take. I didn't, and I remember, and I had this awful situation whereby there was I think what had happened because of the snow, there was a few people that hadn't been able to make it. And so there was two empty seats next to me, right just 1 minute before the show started. Then all of a sudden there was 2 people sitting in the seats. And I think that they'd sort of pulled them down from further back and said, go down the front, like, let's fill up the seats at the front.
Yeah.
And the guy'd been drinking, and he was, if I could use words that I shouldn't be using. He proceeded to chat to his mates. Can you imagine? And I had to get to this point whereby I had to really sort of like keep my own cool and just go, I've got to let this go, because this is not helping things. The experience was fantastic. I actually was so thrilled about it. And we came out, me and my pal Pedro, we were walking back, and we didn't talk. We couldn't talk. The experience had taken our breath away so much. And we got to the bar, and we cracked open a beer, and it all just came out. And we just literally sat and we spoke. Well, I think we just chatted for a couple of hours.
Yeah.
I think that the thing for me that is so enriching as an experience to have, has really come out in anything that Bruce has been doing in the last, perhaps it's decade, I'm not sure, is the way he talks about his weaknesses and his vulnerability, the way, you know, obviously through the autobiography and then through the Broadway performance, there's something so human that you're getting a connection with. You know, I quite often wonder if he is really the most human rock star. I hate that expression, but the most human rock star that we've had the experience of in our lifetime, because he really is willing to go that distance and talk about the vulnerabilities, because it's and I'm so indebted to him for doing that, because it's helped me in my life, to tell you the truth. It's allowed me to not shy away from a lot of things that have shaped my life. You know, relationship with
Yeah.
the way Bruce talks about his relationship with his parents. I find that incredible. And the other part of the human Bruce story, I use quotations.
Yeah.
The other part of it that I'm just in awe of, and was again another facet of the Broadway experience, is because he brings Patty on most nights, and
Right.
man, that relationship. I mean, I'm in a long-term relationship with my partner, and just that relationship just melts my heart. I'm sure they have ups and downs.
Sure.
But
All marriages do.
All marriages do. But that level of loving commitment that I see that exists between the two of them, and his relationship with his kids.
Yeah.
His relationship, but it's really the thing that's touched me most, that has come out of, you know, going to Broadway and hearing him talk about his life, reading the autobiography, is the relationship with his father. That really is something that I can share as well. You know, my father was an alcoholic, and he's not with me anymore. I'm very happy to say that I sort of made amends in my life to him, and when he did pass, which is probably about 10 years ago, I sort of felt like I'd reached a point of a connection with him that I didn't have for many, many years.
Yeah.
And when I read and hear Bruce talk about his relationship with his father, it strikes a chord. It really does.
Yeah, I agree. He shares so much of himself, and I love that honesty and the just directness of it. It's really been a blessing to see. So I want to make sure we have time. You have a new project that's coming out. Talk to me a little bit about this.
Yeah. Again, another pinching myself. I can't believe it. Projects that I'm involved with. So a while ago, there's a tribute band in the UK that is a Bruce Springsteen tribute band with a bit of a difference. I don't know if you've heard of them. It's an all-female tribute act, and they go by the name of the She Street Band.
Okay.
And I got an opportunity. I actually got asked to DJ for them. So in my mind, I thought, this is the closest I'm ever going to get to DJing for Bruce.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
So I took the gig, and obviously I played my Bruce-related DJ set before the She Street Band came on. And they came on, and I went out into the audience, and I stood there watching them and just, smiling, thinking, this is great. And they're really, really good musicians. They're all they're all session musicians who have sort of bonded over their love of Bruce, and one day decided to put together this tribute act called the She Street Band. And as I was watching them, I was thinking, now hang on a minute, this is more than just good. There's something else going on here.
Yeah.
And what I connected was that the songs of Bruce Springsteen, sung through the prism of a all-female tribute act, brought a slightly different twist to the songs. The songs themselves, it's not all of them, but certainly some of them started to just give something else to it. And I was really fascinated by what this thing was. I'm a huge fan of cover versions, massive fan. And in fact, and of course, a great cover version should always bring something new to the party. You shouldn't just be hearing, oh, look, that's that song sung by someone else. It's like a great cover version does that. A really good example of a great cover version for me is, the Carpenters track, We've Only Just Begun.
Sure.
Okay, written by Paul Williams, originally a TV advert sort of recording for like a bank. Mm-hmm. Like it was a couple moving into a house, and it was like, we've only just begun to live. Okay, so take that song and put it in the hands of soul singer Curtis Mayfield, who covered that track live in the 70s. And without him changing one single word of that song, he turns it into a civil rights song.
Yeah.
So he's brought his own thing to the song, and he's just transported it. So that to me is a great cover version. So that's what I look for in a good cover version, and that's what I sort of got this sense of like, oh, there's something else going on here when you listen to women singing Bruce Springsteen songs. So I was hosting a show on the BBC at the time, and I put it out there to listeners, and people started suggesting these female-fronted cover versions of Bruce Springsteen songs, and I started putting them together. And then I thought, hang on a minute, there's something in this. There's a concept in this. So I pitched it to a record label that we've got in the UK, an amazing, like one of the best reissue labels in the world, I would add, and they're called Ace Records. And I said, here's an idea. How about we put together a compilation release of female-fronted Bruce Springsteen songs? And they went, yeah, let's do it. And we've ended up, I'm very happy to say, with 19 absolutely stonking tracks. And the CD is out now.
Yeah. So what's the name of the CD?
I played upon a title of something else. I've called it Ladies Sing the Boss.
Ah, that is perfect.
You can see what I did there.
Yeah. It is an absolutely amazing collection. You sent me a link. I got to hear some. You have a diverse amount of artists that some you will go, oh yeah, I recognize that name, like Patti Smith, Darlene Love, Lucinda Williams. But there's others that you go, well, who is the Shovels and Rope? Who is, Piney Girl? So talk to me a little bit the process of picking what songs and what versions, and just share a little bit about that if you could.
Yeah, well, obviously through the joys of the internet, I was able to spend a lot of time researching this. I mean, I'm a big vinyl record dealer, and I spend a lot of time on sites like Discogs, and you can locate pretty much everything that's ever been recorded. So I just started trolling, and I was like, that was it. I was off and running. I was going down rabbit holes, and I was finding connections to. There's a lot out there, and it just boils down to this thing of, what are the best ones? In a very practical sense, who can we get clearance on? I think of everything that I requested, as far as I remember, oh no, there was one artist who said that they weren't willing to get involved in the project, and that was Joan Jett, because Joan Jett had obviously recorded, correct me if I'm wrong here, Remain in Light, which was the title track to a Michael J. Fox movie.
Yeah, Light of Day. Yes,
Light of Day. Thank you. Yeah, so that was the only one that we didn't get an approval on, and pretty much everything was just like the top ones that I could find, and I really appreciate you connecting with the fact that there's what I wanted to do was get a real spread of musical styles across the collection as well. So what you get is like the beautiful soul renderings of Betty Lavette and her performance of Streets of Philadelphia. You'll have a country twinged moment with Emmylou Harris doing My Father's House. But what I've noticed, and you've alluded to it a little bit earlier, is there's like a generation of, if I use the term indie or alt, female performers that where I'm coming from. They're slightly out of the mainstream. There's a singer called Lucy Dacus who does a beautiful rendition of Dancing in the Dark. Soccer Mummy and I'm on Fire is another one. The guys you referenced, Shovels and Rope, and their version of Johnny 99. And the more I dug deeper into it, I was finding that there was basically a generation of female singers. And this is so brilliantly obvious where this goes. There was a generation of female singers that were coming of age in the last sort of in the last 10 years, so to speak. And of course, they'd grown up with their dad's record collections. So Bruce is just huge for them in their lives. And so whenever they get to do a performance of a Bruce song, whether it's live or they cut it as a cover version, they've usually got their dad in mind. And again, as I mentioned in the sleeve notes, with that version of Dancing in the Dark, Lucy Dacus, who actually performs that, she says it's really, really nice the way she came to it, because she says that Bruce was number one in her house when she was growing up as a kid, and was, to the point whereby she wasn't interested. As a coming of age as a teenager, she didn't want to hear about her dad's record collection. She wanted, like all great teenagers should, they should rebel against their parents' taste. But then she said that a few years later, when she heard Dancing in the Dark again, it was like she was hearing it for the first time. And I'm quoting her now, and she says, "I remember listening to Dancing in the Dark like what it felt like for the first time. When he sings, I want to change my clothes, my hair, my face. I had never, and this is the bit, I had never heard a man express discontent with their appearance like that. I thought that low self-esteem was reserved for young women like myself. All of a sudden, I was not alone." So that, to me, is a beautiful sort of roundabout way of coming to Bruce. And again, it's that tapping into that thing we were talking about just before. It's Bruce's willingness to share his vulnerability. And yes, it might be dressed up with cars and girls and all the other cliches that people use when they go, "I don't really like Bruce Springsteen." But that's because they're just seeing the superficial, like, sort of icing on the cake. When you get in there, you will find a man who is very vulnerable and just trying to find his way in the world.
I agree, Sean. So where is the album available from? Where, if someone wants to order it, where's the best way?
Okay, so if you are someone like myself who still likes to go into record shops, please go into your local record store, and if they haven't got it, get them to order it in. It's available on CD now, but you can pick it up you can pick it up online from whatever outlet you choose to use. But if you want to, you can go to the record company that are putting it out, and that is acerecords.com, and you will find a copy of it there waiting for you.
I will include that link in the show notes. What's next? What's next for Sean?
What's next is tonight I'm going out and I'm spreading the joy of music with a DJ set down in London under the banner of Guilty Pleasures. And I'm off doing a number of festivals across the summer. I'm just a man who's just in love with the job that he does. That is awesome. That is awesome. Gosh, we've had such a good talk. What are there anything else you're searching for? Any Bruce, when we see Bruce live again, are there songs that you are still chasing, you want to hear? There are, well, since the last time, obviously, the last time I saw him full band performance was back in 2016 with the Revisited River. Mm-hmm. So there's been a fair bit since then. I am such a huge fan of Western Stars. Yeah, I love that. That album just blew me away, and I would adore to see a performance of any of those tracks on there, because that was that was so brilliantly out of the blue, wasn't it? It was like, I know he'd been sitting on a lot of that music for a long time, but just that moment when that, I remember, and I was on holiday when that arrived, that album, so I just fired it up on Spotify and said to my wife, I said, I'm just going for a walk along the beach, and I just listened to that album, and that was it. I fell in love. I love the film. Just seeing so that, good, I wanted to be in that barn so badly. I just love it.
This is great.
Thanks,
Any
man.
final thoughts before we get to the Mary question?
Is there any thoughts on Bruce? I mean, it's funny, because I feel like I'm going to see McCartney in a few weeks' time because he's headlining at Glastonbury, and it's pretty obvious that'll be the last time that I probably will see Paul McCartney perform live. Will it be the last time that I see Bruce perform live the next time? Oh, are we going into this chapter really? I mean, you and I, he's got, what's he got on us? 10 years, 15
Yeah,
years, something like that.
yeah. He's in
So
his 72.
yeah,
So yeah.
yeah. So he's like, I don't know about you, but is it an uncle? Is he your, when you try and figure out, because he's been such a major part of my life.
Yeah.
And each release felt like it was talking to me at that point in my life.
Absolutely.
So many connections that I had that were going on. So yeah, it's that, and the vulnerability that he's expressing in this part of his life, I feel very connected to. So
Yeah.
I'm just on board for the journey, and as it unfolds, it's a wondrous thing. Yeah,
Sounds awesome.
I almost feel emotional now.
No, I get you. I get you. All right. Listeners, if you have joined us because you're a fan of Sean and his different projects, thank you for listening. I end every episode with the Mary question. Jay Armstrong is an honors English teacher, recently retired in the Philadelphia area. And he would, when he was teaching, he would take 2 days in his honors English class, and they would spend it breaking down Thunder Road. They would look at all the lyrics. They would talk about the imagery Bruce is using, the themes Bruce explores. He would compare this to Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken, and other poets. And then at the end of the class, he would ask the question, does Mary get in the car? So Sean, that is your question. Does Mary get in the car at the end of Thunder Road?
No, I've never seen Mary get in the car. No. Okay. It's he's getting out of town. It's always on the move.
Okay.
At that point of the story, if I was to reflect on that song now, Mary's in the car. Do you know what I mean by that? It's like
Yes.
the transition of the character and where it's at. So if Thunder Road was a new release and it was coming out on the new album, she's definitely getting in the car. At that stage, no, she's not getting in the car. But Jesse, you've just made me think of one story that I want to, if it's okay to share with you,
Yes.
because you know what, I'll probably never get the chance to share this story.
All right, I love it.
Because it's a Thunder Road themed story. So I almost, should I share it? Hang on,
gotta share it now.
It's quite personal.
Okay.
I might get in contact with you afterwards before you air this and say, do you know what? Let's not have that story in there. Could you cut it?
All right.
I'll give it to you. I'll give it to you with the proviso that if I get in contact with you afterwards and say, no, please don't put that out, you'll cut it.
Do you want me to stop the recording? Or
no.
Okay.
You record it and then
then absolutely you can call me back and say yes. So
okay. So I was a single. I was a single man at the time.
Okay.
I'm giving that. I'm adding that to the mix.
Okay.
And it was 1990, and I was in Australia, and I was on holiday. It was Christmas time. It was 89 into 90, and I was with a group of my best friends. There was 5 of us, male and female, and we all went over to Australia for a whole month. And I just had this encounter with this woman, and this encounter involved this. There was this moment where we were in a club in Sydney, and she said, do you want to come back to mine? And I was like, wow, this doesn't happen that often. And here I am on the other side of the world, and who am I to refuse the
Yes.
advances of a beautiful Australian woman. The only thing was that going back to hers, as we headed back, which was like this sort of, it was on in the suburbs of Sydney, was that she didn't tell me that we weren't actually going back to hers because she still lived with her parents.
Oh,
And where
no.
we were going back to her aunt's house because her aunt happened to be out of town and she knew that house was available. And we arrived at the house, and at which point I was expecting her to pull out a key, and she didn't have a key. And she said, "No, you've got to break in."
Oh, no.
So she said, "But it's okay. You don't have to break any window." I know. And she lifted the latch on the, it was like a 1-story type of house with a porch. And the 1-story house, so I went in through the toilet window and went to the front door, opened up the front door, went in and proceeded to spend a very beautiful romantic experience with this young lady. And just before we were drifting off to sleep, it was Australia, and I know you're in Texas in 90-degree heat, but I'd never experienced heat like that. So all the windows were open and all the doors were open, and there was a screen door that was open on the porch. And you know what happened? We were just drifting off to sleep and the screen door slammed. And I went, holy shit. And I was transported to a moment where I was in the song. So Thunder Road means a lot to me.
I love that. That is awesome. That is so, so great.
And I swear to you, it was having, obviously the song was everything to me, and it was just, I was in the moment, and and if the transistor radio wasn't on, it came on, and I think Roy Orbison was singing.
That's awesome. That is a great story. If someone wants to reach you, what's the best way? Are you on social media?
I'm up on Facebook. You'll find me there. You'll find my sort of radio broadcast. I tend to post on there. My name is Sean Rowley, SeanRowley. You can connect also through Guilty Pleasures, my club brand that I operate as well.
Okay, very nice. Thank you. That sounds great. This has been so much fun. We will have to do it again.
Jesse, I can't thank you enough. It's just to be able to. Now it's so lovely. As I said before, it's usually I'm listening in, and it's like I feel like I want to contribute to the conversation. I'm now in the conversation.
Oh, well, I love it, and you are welcome anytime. Listeners, go get vaccinated, go get boosted, and let's be kind to each other because that's how we're going to get through this. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, listeners. We'll talk to you soon. Goodbye. Doing a podcast at times can be a one-way conversation, and I hate that. So please let me know what you like and don't like about the work I'm doing. You can reach the podcast via email at setlistingbruce@gmail.com. The show is on Twitter at setlistingbruce, and my personal Twitter is at jessejacksondfw. We have a website, www.setlistingbruce.com. From there, you can find links to other Springsteen podcasts as well as other music-themed podcasts. We have a page devoted to our own SLB All-Star Band. These are guests who have been on the podcast more than 3 times. There is a link to our store where you can purchase Set Listing Bruce shirts as well as a Merry Question t-shirt. There is a link to our Patreon page where you can sign up to help support the podcast financially. We have different levels and different rewards based on your support. If you don't have any extra cash, and right now who does, you can support the podcast by subscribing via your favorite podcast player and leaving us a review. The more reviews we have, the easier it is for people to find us. And please tell a friend about the podcast, especially if they love Bruce or music, because it will make a difference.
You just heard the fun talking, hard rocking, music loving, album ranking, fan thinking, joy spreading, lyric reading, story sharing podcast That is the one, the only Set Listing Bruce. The theme for Set Listing Bruce was written by David Rosen, used by permission.